8 meters underwater, in water so dark, divers can only work by touch. A gloved hand closes around a piece of stone. It's a knife, a biface deliberately shaped by someone's hands. It's locked inside mud that hasn't shifted since the day it settled there. Right next to it lies a mastodon tusk, carved with deep, parallel grooves. The lab result comes back, 14,150 years old. That's 1,500 years earlier than the first Americans were ever supposed to exist. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. This site had been quietly saying the exact same thing since the 1980s. Nobody listened. A sinkhole that sealed away the Ice Age. The place is called Page Ladson. It sits at the bottom of the Osceola River in North Florida, roughly 30 miles from Tallahassee, inside a sinkhole that swallowed a slice of the Ice Age, and then sealed it shut for thousands of years. You need to picture what these divers are actually working in. This isn't clear blue water with a film crew nearby. The Osceola runs tannic, stained the color of strong tea, and once you drop just a few meters down, the light disappears completely. Archaeologists descend with lights that barely cut through the darkness. They follow guide ropes and dig almost entirely by feel. They pull sediment up through a hose. They identify finds by touch, by memory, by the shape of an object pressed against a glove, and there's a reason they keep going back down there. A sinkhole like this is close to a perfect time capsule. No plow has ever disturbed it. No burrowing animal has churned it up. No frost has heaved it around. No tree roots have pushed through it. No construction crew has ever touched it. The water itself is low in oxygen, which means wood survives down there. Plant material survives, tusks survive. Sediment settles quietly in layers and stays exactly where it lands. A younger layer sits above an older one, and everything between them stays frozen in time. So when a stone tool comes up out of that mud, nobody gets to claim it simply fell there by accident. That's really the whole issue in a single sentence. The object itself was never actually the controversial part. Stone tools turn up all the time. Mastodon bones turn up all the time. What made this particular site so explosive was the mud surrounding it, the date attached to it, the order of the layers. Because that knife and that carved tusk were sitting inside a sealed, undisturbed sequence roughly 15 centuries older than the first Americans were supposedly allowed to exist. The wall called Clovis? First. To understand why that mattered so much, you need to understand exactly what wall this discovery slammed into. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology ran on a single dominant idea, known as Clovis first. It was clean, it was elegant, it was easy to teach in a classroom. Back in 1929, near Clovis, New Mexico, and later at a place called Blackwater Draw, researchers uncovered beautifully crafted fluted spear points lying among the bones of mammoths. Those same distinctive points kept turning up across the continent, all dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, and from there, the story more or less wrote itself. A single population walked out of Siberia, crossed the Bering Land Bridge, came down through a corridor that opened between two melting ice sheets, and spread across two entire continents within just a few centuries. Big game hunters, one wave, one route, one clean starting date. To be fair, this model wasn't foolish. It was built on genuine evidence, and for decades it survived every test thrown at it. It made predictions, and those predictions held up. But a clean, simple story becomes dangerous the moment it turns into a career structure. Because Clovis first didn't just describe the past anymore, it became a rule. If your excavation produced a date older than Clovis, the burden of proof landed on you like a collapsing building. And there were 4 words that could quietly erase almost any inconvenient discovery. Disturbed, contaminated, redeposited, geofact. The layer must have shifted. The carbon must have leached in from elsewhere. The rock must have broken naturally. The dig must have been sloppy. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single one of those objections is legitimate. Every one of them is sometimes genuinely true. And that's exactly what made them such an effective weapon. Nobody ever had to hide evidence. Doubt did all the work on its own. 20 years in the disputed pile. Now go back to Page Ladson, because this is where the story turns genuinely frustrating. This site wasn't actually discovered in 2016. It was first excavated back in the 1980s and 1990s, led by researchers, including James Dunbar and paleontologist S. David Webb. They pulled stone tools out of that mud. They pulled up that same mastodon tusk with its long, deep, parallel gouges. They ran dating tests. The results came back pre-Clovis. And for the most part, the field simply filed it under interesting unproven and moved on. Sit with what that actually means. The evidence was already out of the ground. It was already published in the scientific literature. It just sat there in the disputed pile for roughly 20 years, because accepting it would have cost the field far more than quietly dismissing it did. Then between 2012 and 2014, a new team went back down. Jesse Halligan from Florida State University and Michael Waters from Texas A&M, along with a dive crew, descended into that black water and re-excavated the sinkhole using modern methods, modern documentation, modern dating techniques. This time, they found a biface still sitting in place, sealed inside an undisturbed layer, with the full sediment sequence intact above and below it. Not something pulled from a spoil pile, not something recovered through a screen, sitting exactly where it had been left. They ran a tight, careful series of radiocarbon dates on plant material from the surrounding sediment. Not a single date, a whole series of them. The result? 14 out of 550 years old, published in the journal Science Advances in 2016. And here's the sting. Nothing genuinely new had to be discovered. The site had been telling the same story for an entire generation already. Chile says the same thing from 4,000 miles away because Florida wasn't alone in this. Travel roughly 4,000 miles south to a peat bog in southern Chile called Monte Verde. Archaeologist Tom Dillehay began working there in the late 1970s. That waterlogged peat had done something almost unheard of in archaeology. It preserved the soft, fragile material, wood, plant remains, the remnants of ancient structures, things that would normally rot away within a single century, somehow still sitting there intact after 14,000 years. And the field came after it, not through any conspiracy, but through papers, peer reviews, conference sessions, and a steady, grinding insistence that something about it simply had to be wrong. For nearly 20 years, Dillehay defended that site. Critics claimed the wood must be natural debris. The dates must be off. The stratigraphy must have been misread. The artifacts weren't really artifacts at all. He wasn't just defending a single number. He was defending the idea that the entire accepted map could be wrong. In 1997, a group of prominent skeptics, including Vance Haynes, the geoscientist who had long been Clovis First's most rigorous and formidable defender, traveled to Chile to see the site with their own eyes. They conceded, in print, that Dillehay had been right all along. That should have ended the argument completely. It didn't. Within just a couple of years, fresh critiques started appearing again, old arguments resurfaced, and the atmosphere never really cleared. Dillehay had been correct for 20 straight years. He never got a headline for it. He got exhaustion instead. And here's the detail that should have completely shattered the old model and somehow still didn't. Monte Verde sits roughly 14,000 kilometers from where the ice-free corridor was supposed to be. If people were already living there 14,000 years ago, they clearly didn't arrive the week before. They had to have entered the Americas well before that, then spread across 2 entire continents, adapting to deserts, mountains, rainforests, and coastlines along the way. The Chilean date wasn't just an inconvenient number. It was a distance problem, and distance problems are far worse than simple date disputes, because you can't wave them away by claiming a sample was contaminated. The coal country objection, that was never proven now, head north to Pennsylvania. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is a sandstone overhang located about 30 miles southwest of Pittsburgh. James Adovasio began excavating there in 1973, and he did it exactly the way you're supposed to. Obsessive documentation, tight quality control, deep stratigraphy, layer stacked carefully on layer like the pages of a book. The deepest human occupation levels produced dates pushing past 16,000 years old. The objection arrived quickly. The site sits in coal country, and critics argued that ancient carbon, coal particles, dissolved organic material carried through groundwater, could have leached into the samples and made them test older than they really were. That's a legitimate chemical concern, and it absolutely deserved to be raised. But here's what happened next. That same objection got raised and raised again and raised yet again for decades. And in all that time, nobody actually demonstrated it. Nobody ever produced the contaminated carbon. Nobody ever showed the contamination mechanism actually working at Meadowcroft. The objection was stated, repeated, cited, and used constantly. But it was never proven. Meanwhile, Adovasios spent an entire career answering it. In the eyes of much of the field, he became the man who simply couldn't accept no for an answer. A difficult personality, someone who just wouldn't stop insisting he was right. That's exactly how this dynamic works. You don't need to destroy someone's discovery outright. You just need to make the person defending it look unreasonable, and then wait. The objection did its job perfectly. It protected the old model for far longer than the actual evidence ever justified. An entire workshop, not just one strange rock. By this point, you might be thinking, fine, a handful of unusual sites. Every scientific field has a few of those. So let's talk about sheer volume instead. In 2011, Michael Waters and colleagues published findings from the Deborah L. Friedkin site in central Texas along Buttermilk Creek. This wasn't one strange stone sitting in one strange layer. This was thousands of stone artifacts. Flakes, blades, finished tools, the ordinary everyday debris left behind by people making things, all sitting in a clay layer directly beneath the Clovis material, sealed underneath the very layer that was supposed to represent the very beginning of everything. That clay layer was dated using optically stimulated luminescence, a technique that measures the last time individual mineral grains were exposed to sunlight. The result? Roughly 15,000 years old. This is exactly where the standard dismissal script starts to fall apart, because that script was built to handle anomalies, one stray tool, one odd bone, one unusual date. You can always argue that a single item somehow slipped through a crack. You cannot reasonably argue that an entire workshop floor slipped through a crack. One anomaly might be a mistake. 15,000 artifacts is an entire occupation. Certainty. Defending itself. Let's pause here and be completely honest about what was actually happening throughout all of this, because I don't want to sell you a movie villain that never existed. There was no secret committee. Nobody locked evidence away in a vault somewhere. There's no hidden memo to uncover. What existed instead was something far more ordinary, and honestly, far more effective. There was peer review, staffed largely by people whose entire careers had been built on the old model. There were funding panels where proposing to dig for pre-Clovis material essentially meant asking to spend someone's grant money chasing a claim the field had already rejected. There were textbooks with that corridor confidently drawn on the map, printed and reprinted year after year. There were museum displays cast in fiberglass, with arrows pointing in the only officially sanctioned direction. And there was a kind of reputational contagion. Once a site got labeled controversial, simply associating with it cost researchers something real. Students learned that lesson quickly. Their graduate advisors made sure of it. None of that requires any malice whatsoever. All it requires is ordinary inertia and the very human instinct to protect a story you've spent 30 years of your career teaching. This isn't a conspiracy, it's certainty defending itself. And certainty defending itself does far more damage than any actual conspiracy ever could, because it never has to admit it's doing anything wrong at all. The Tusk's second story. Now come back to Florida, because Paige Ladson actually had a second story buried inside it that most people completely missed. That tusk. Daniel Fisher, a specialist in mastodon and mammoth remains, examined the cut marks running along it. Deep parallel grooves consistent with someone deliberately cutting through the connective tissue that holds a tusk inside its socket, working it free from the skull of a dead animal. Sit with that image for a second. Someone knelt in the mud at the edge of an ancient watering hole right beside a dead mastodon and carefully cut its tusk free from its skull, likely for the ivory or simply for the raw material. And at some point, they lost their knife in the mud, and it stayed there for 14,500 years, quietly waiting for a diver to eventually find it in the dark. The tool outlived the hand that made it. But the sinkhole had one more thing to reveal, and this one quietly undermined a completely different textbook idea. Researchers analyzed something called spore ormila, a type of fungal spore that grows specifically in the dung of large herbivores. How much of it shows up in sediment tracks, roughly how many big animals were living in an area at any given time. And at Paige Ladson, those spores show large Ice Age animals persisting in the region for roughly 2,000 years, after humans had already arrived there. That creates a real problem for the tidy overkill narrative, where humans supposedly show up and wipe out the megafauna within just a few centuries. Instead, people and mastodons appear to have shared that exact landscape side by side for a very long stretch of time, one single sinkhole quietly straining two separate textbook narratives at once. A footprint is not a geofact. And then the entire argument stopped being about dates, sediment chemistry, and invisible molecules, and became something a child could look at and immediately understand. New Mexico. White sands, a dried-up ancient lakebed inside a national park, where gypsum dunes stretch out endlessly and constant wind keeps uncovering and reburying the ground. 23,000 years ago sits deep inside the peak of the last ice age. The glaciers were at their absolute maximum extent. The corridor was completely closed. Under the standard model, absolutely nobody was supposed to be anywhere south of that ice sheet. Not in New Mexico, not walking casually around a lake. And what these tracks actually record isn't some abstract hunting party. In one striking sequence, a young person, likely an adolescent or a small adult based on the print size, walks across wet mud while carrying a toddler. You can clearly see where they set the child down. Tiny footprints suddenly appear. Then they vanish again, and the adult's prints sink noticeably deeper as they pick the child back up and keep walking. Along other parts of that same mudflat, you can find the tracks of mammoths and giant ground sloths moving through the same space. You can argue endlessly about a stone tool. You can call it a geofact. You can question the layer it came from, or the person who excavated it. A footprint is a person walking. There's no other way to read it. The field's response was immediate, and I want to be completely clear here. It was entirely legitimate. The critique centered on what's called the hard water reservoir effect. Ditch grass is an aquatic plant, and it absorbs carbon directly from the water it grows in. If that water is fed by ancient groundwater carrying old, dissolved carbon, the plant can end up absorbing carbon that's already thousands of years old, which would make the radiocarbon date on its seeds come out artificially too old. That's a real, well-understood problem in the field, and it was exactly the right question to ask. So researchers went back and tested it using an entirely different approach. They ran radiocarbon dating on conifer pollen from land-based trees that pull their carbon straight out of the air, not out of lake water. No reservoir effect possible there at all. Same result. Then they used optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains directly in the sediment. A completely independent method that has nothing to do with carbon whatsoever. It simply measures the last time those grains were exposed to sunlight. Same result again. 3 separate methods. 2 of them completely immune to the original objection. The 2023 results held firm. Same answer, same answer, same answer. That consistency was exactly the problem for skeptics. Once the ceiling breaks, and once that ceiling breaks, the room sitting above it stops having a solid floor. In 2020, a team led by Cyprian Ardeline published findings from Chiquihuite Cave, high in the mountains of northern Mexico, claiming stone artifacts dating back as far as 26,500 years. I want to be careful here, because this particular claim remains genuinely contested and is not accepted by most of the field. The core criticism is serious. Many researchers argue the supposed tools are actually geofacts, naturally fractured limestone from a cave environment that produces broken rock entirely on its own. That debate remains unresolved, and the skeptics may very well turn out to be right. But watch what this particular argument reveals about the field itself. Because the reflex, doubt fast, doubt hard, doubt loudest, is now so deeply trained into this discipline that it fires automatically at almost everything. The warning from a museum drawer. Which brings us to the strangest chapter in this entire story, and the one where I need you to hear the caveat just as loudly as the claim itself. In 1992, a highway construction crew in San Diego was cutting into a hillside for a road expansion project. A paleontological monitor spotted bone fragments. Work stopped, and excavation revealed what turned out to be the remains of a mastodon. The bones were broken with spiral fractures, the kind you typically get when bone is smashed while it's still fresh. Scattered around them were heavy cobbles that, to some researchers, resembled hammerstones and anvils, showing damage patterns alongside broken stone fragments. The material was boxed up and placed into museum storage, where it sat for roughly 25 years. Then, in 2017, a research team published findings on the Sruti mastodon site in the journal Nature, dating the bone material using uranium-thorium methods to roughly 130,000 years old, and arguing that some early hominin species had deliberately smashed those bones open. Let me say this as plainly as I possibly can. That specific claim is overwhelmingly rejected by the scientific community. Most archaeologists simply do not accept it. The far more obvious explanation is that these bones were crushed by heavy construction machinery during the highway excavation itself. There are no stone tools anywhere at the site, no cut marks, no human remains. Nothing else in that entire deposit points toward people. The specialists who pushed back against this claim weren't being cowardly. They were absolutely right to push back hard. So why does this story even belong here at all? Because of where it came from. A museum storage drawer, a box sitting quietly on a shelf, a site that had already been excavated, bagged, cataloged, and essentially forgotten for a quarter of a century, until somebody eventually went back, applied new methods, and asked a question that would have once been completely unaskable. And because of what its existence reveals about how much the overall argument had shifted in just 20 years. But there's a much better question sitting underneath all of this, and it's the one that actually starts to solve the real mystery. If people were already in Florida by 14,500 years ago, in Chile by roughly the same time, in Texas by 15,500, in Pennsylvania by 16,000, and in New Mexico by 23,000, then where exactly is the trail connecting all of it? Where are the sites leading from Alaska down through every one of these locations? Why is that particular record so incredibly thin? Here's the answer, and it's almost darkly funny once you see it. They were searching in the wrong place entirely. Look at the Channel Islands off the coast of California. Human remains known as Arlington Springs Man have been dated to roughly 13,000 years old. And here's the key detail about those islands. They were never connected to the mainland, not even at the lowest sea levels of the entire Ice Age. Somebody had to cross open water to reach them. Head north to the coast of British Columbia. On Calvert Island, archaeologists excavated beneath a modern beach and discovered human footprints pressed into ancient clay, dated to around 13,000 years old. Nearby, Haida Gwaii has produced its own early coastal sites as well. These weren't people who wandered down some inland corridor squeezed between two ice sheets. These were people who lived directly on a coastline, ate from that coastline, and traveled steadily along it. That's the model researchers like John Erlandson have been pushing for years, a Pacific Rim coastal migration route, sometimes nicknamed the Kelp Highway. A rich marine ecosystem full of fish, shellfish, seals, and kelp itself, stretching from Northeast Asia around the Pacific Rim and down the entire American West Coast. No corridor required. No waiting around for ice to melt. Just a boat and a shoreline stretching out ahead of you. And now here's the detail that really seals it. At the height of the Ice Age, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. The coastline those people actually walked along is completely gone now. It's underwater, kilometers offshore, buried deep beneath sediment out on the continental shelf, drowned by the very same melting ice that eventually let the rest of us into the story. For 50 years, archaeologists searched almost exclusively across the interior of North America, found relatively little, and treated that absence as proof of something. Then genetics made everything even messier. And then genetic research arrived and complicated the entire picture even further. In Montana, at a site called Anzick, researchers found the remains of an infant, a Clovis-era child, roughly 12,700 years old, buried carefully with red ochre and stone tools. Not just a specimen to study, but a child buried by people who clearly cared enough to cover them in pigment and lay tools gently beside them. In 2014, that child's genome was sequenced, and it linked directly to the ancestry of the vast majority of present-day indigenous peoples across the Americas. Then, Upward Sun River in Alaska produced something else entirely. Evidence of a population geneticists now call the ancient Beringians, a lineage that split off from the ancestors of other Native American groups far earlier than the old tidy corridor timeline ever had room for. People sitting isolated in Beringia for thousands of years before anyone ever walked south. And then there's a signal nobody has been able to fully explain. Researchers, including Pontus Skoglund and David Reich, reported a faint but genuine genetic connection between certain Amazonian populations and groups in Australasia. It's real, and it clearly shows up in the data. It has never been satisfactorily explained. Whatever population originally carried that signal into South America, we simply haven't found their remains yet. Genetics didn't just add a new date to argue about, it added multiple separate waves of migration and at least one genuine ghost population still waiting to be identified. So where does this actually leave us? Here's what stands on solid ground. Pre-Clovis presence in the Americas is no longer a fringe position. It's now the mainstream consensus. Monteverde is accepted. Page-Ladson is accepted. The Friedkin site holds up. Meadowcroft's dates have never actually been shown to be contaminated, despite decades of that exact accusation. People were clearly in the Americas well before 13,000 years ago, and a coastal migration route is now the leading explanation for how they got there. Here's what remains genuinely contested. White Sands has survived 3 completely independent dating approaches, and the case for it is strong. But its full implications, a confirmed human presence at the absolute peak of the Ice Age, are still being actively argued over, and honest, serious researchers still disagree about what it fully means. Here's what isn't accepted. Chiquihuite remains disputed. Jerruti is rejected by nearly the entire field, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make a better story. The Amazonian genetic signal remains unexplained, not solved. And here's what never actually happened. There was no public reckoning. Clovis First didn't collapse in some dramatic public moment. Nobody stood up at a conference and formally apologized to Tom Dillahay for 20 years of relentless criticism. Nobody wrote to James Adovasio and admitted they should have actually tested their objection instead of simply repeating it for decades. No textbook printed a correction. No museum label ever said plainly, "We were wrong, and we were loudly wrong, and it cost real people." The old model simply faded away quietly. The corridor arrow on the map got smaller and smaller. New maps quietly added a coastal migration line. Papers stopped mentioning the fight altogether. Museum panels softened into cautious, vague phrasing. Recent evidence suggests the timing remains under investigation. An entire generation of students learned the new version of the story and never even knew there had been a war over it in the first place. The retreat happened entirely in footnotes. Dillahay and Adovasio weren't vindicated with a headline. They were vindicated with silence, and that's the detail I genuinely can't shake. The doubt itself was reasonable. Every single individual objection raised along the way was scientifically defensible on its own terms, and that's precisely what made it such an effective weapon. Nobody ever had to destroy or hide the evidence. They only had to keep calling it contamination for long enough that the people carrying it eventually grew too tired to keep fighting. So picture it one more time. Back down into the oscilla, back through that tannin-stained black water, past the guideline, into the sediment where light simply doesn't reach. That biface is still down there in that mud, sealed inside a layer that has never once moved, resting beside a tusk that someone cut free with their own hands 14,500 years ago, on an ordinary day at a watering hole that nobody recorded and nobody remembers. It waited 30 years for a field that simply wasn't ready to hear it yet. Now pull back up through the river, out over the Florida coastline, and keep going. Out past the beach, past the surf, out over the continental shelf, where the water grows deep and dark and simply stays that way. Somewhere out there, underneath all of that water, is an entire shoreline. Camps, hearths, middens. The actual road these ancient people once walked. It took nearly 3 decades for the scientific world to fully accept a single sinkhole in Florida. How much longer is it going to take before anyone actually goes looking out there?